You're tuned to Mountain States Policy Center.
And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Mountain States Policy Center's Peak Policy here on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter. I'm Chris Cargill, the president of Mountain States Policy Center, and we're glad you're with us to have a preview of the legislative sessions that are coming up, not only here in Idaho, but also all across the Mountain States. And we'll talk more about those legislative sessions with Jason Mercier, who's our vice president for research at Mountain States Policy Center, as well as Madi Clark, one of our senior policy analysts at Mountain States Policy Center. If you have any questions, comments, things you want to talk about, go to the chat function, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. Let us know your questions, your comments, who you are, and then we will try to get to them throughout the program today. All right, let's talk a little bit about the upcoming legislative sessions, how they're playing out all across the region. You can see Idaho starts on January 8th, so this coming Monday. There is no legislative session in Montana this year. Washington also starts on January 8th, and Wyoming starts on Monday, February 12th. We're already starting to see some bills that are being introduced in both Washington and Wyoming, but it is likely we're not going to see any real pieces of legislation come out from Idaho for at least a couple of weeks. In Idaho, the state budget, public education, education choice, Medicaid spending are some of the topics that are going to be top of mind as legislators return to Boise this year. Washington is a short 60-day legislative session. The supplemental state budget is up. Carbon tax changes will be talked about, as well as housing. Wyoming, similar to what's going on, a shorter legislative session, as is the case in Washington. It's a budget session. Education choice will also be on the agenda in Wyoming. And the 30-day residency requirement to vote will also be top of mind in Wyoming as well. Look at these bills, the number of bills that are introduced in our various states. We'll start, of course, here in Idaho. 635 bills introduced in the last legislative session. Montana, 1,776. Washington, 1,773. Wyoming, 497. So, of course, we look at the 635 here number at home and think, man, that's a lot of legislation. But you look at Montana and Wyoming, Montana and Washington, they have a lot as well. But how many of these bills actually become law? In Idaho, in the last legislative session, only 53% of that 635 became law. And you can see that's one of the lowest numbers we've had for at least the past 6, 7, 8 years. In Washington, only 18% of the bills that were introduced actually became law. And of course, in Montana, 25% of the bills that were introduced in the last legislative session actually became law. Again, Montana does not have a legislative session this year. They only do sessions every other year. Let's welcome in Jason Mercier, who's our vice president and director of research at Mountain States Policy Center. Jason, good afternoon to you.
Chris, great to be with you.
You know, it's always fun to do these shows because not only, Jason, do we get to talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislative session, but sometimes we get to make predictions as well. And I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions, but just kind of your general thoughts going into this legislative session, not only here in Idaho, but across the Mountain States.
Yeah, thank you. So before we get into Idaho, because we have several legislative recommendations that we're going to be making to lawmakers for the January 8th, let me touch a little bit on the 3 other states as far as what to expect. You mentioned Montana actually isn't meeting this session, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a serious policy debate happening right now in that state. And just like you're going to see across Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, a lot of these states saw a huge influx of new residents, of migration, a lot coming out of the COVID lockdowns, people looking for more freedoms, more opportunities. So we saw a huge increase in population in these states. And generally when that occurs, you'll see an increase in your land values and your home values, and ultimately sometimes your property taxes. So property taxes are a huge issue in Montana and Wyoming right now. And Governor Gianforte in Montana has called basically a legislative task force to look at ways to reform that system. So even though the legislature is not going to be in session, you're going to see a lot of debate around that. Same thing is somewhat happening in Wyoming on property taxes. In Washington, all the other mountain states have really been doing what we've been seeing across the country, and that is tax relief. We saw a lot of income tax reductions, property tax reductions. Washington, the last few years, has gone the opposite direction. Passed the state's first income tax with a capital gains tax, increased gas prices with a cap and trade environmental policy, basically required all Washingtonians to have a long-term care policy, which is almost 0.58% there of their paycheck for a new tax. And in response to that, citizens have taken advantage of their right of initiative and submitted 4 ballot measures. Now, these aren't going to be necessarily ballot measures to the people. They're what's called ballot measures to the legislature, which means when the lawmaker convenes here next week, they're going to have to consider proposals to repeal the capital gains income tax, to repeal the cap and trade gas taxes, to allow more Washingtonians to opt out of the long-term care tax, and then to kind of once and for all stop any efforts to impose an income tax over Washington with a ban on state or local income taxes. These all got enough signatures. They're going to be before the legislature next year, which kind of shapes this coming session to be maybe one focused on tax relief.
And Jason, not only that, but I think as you mentioned, the reason why we're bringing this up, of course, Mountain States Policy Center is based in Idaho, but the reason we're bringing this up is because that impacts what we do here in Idaho as well. That impacts the number of people moving from Washington to Idaho. This impacts perhaps the policy recommendations that we might have on tax policy. For instance, in the last legislative session, we were really encouraging lawmakers in Idaho and Montana to take advantage of the fact that Washington was adopting this capital gains income tax and that it was so high in terms of the cost and percentage. And that can actually help our states and other states as well. So it's important, I think, for people to understand that when we're talking about policy, we don't live inside a bubble. What happens in other states can unfortunately, or sometimes fortunately, impact what happens here at home as well. So Jason, I'd like to go ahead and get to some of the recommendations that we're making on the transparency side and governance. And these apply specifically to Idaho, but I think some of them have a broader reach as well. So let's take a look at the first one.
Yeah, so we will, as you have indicated here, have our legislative session starting next week. And you mentioned that we may not see bills right away. And that's because in Idaho, the bills are essentially introduced by the committee, whereas in some of these other states, lawmakers can be already pre-filing dozens to hundreds of bills. Because of that, it's really important to have a lot of public notice and transparency on what a committee is doing with those bills. And when you look at Idaho's legislative rules right now, we don't see the best practice that you see in a lot of other states, and that's to require basically a time period. Some states have 3 days, some 5 days, some 7 days. Because Idaho is a shorter session, what we're advocating for is that the legislature amend its rules when they come in next week so that the public is provided at least 3 days notice of when a hearing is going to be held and what the actual content of that hearing is, what the bills are, what the details are. And this allows us to all participate intelligently in the process because we actually know what we should be paying attention to and what we should be testifying on. And even with remote testimony, you still have to schedule time out of your workday, out of your school day to know you should be making your voice heard. And this 3 day notice is kind of a standard best practice to kind of put the citizens back in the driver's seat as far as participation in the legislative process.
And Jason, we've created this video that I'd like to show that encourages legislators to really stick to what we're calling the rule of 3. So let's take a look.
Do political leaders really want to hear from you? Lawmakers at our state capitol should amend the rules to require at least 3 days public notice of bills to be heard. That way, no matter where you live, you'll have the chance to decide whether you want to give your opinion. Lobbyists and activists may like the current setup, but the process shuts out average citizens. We can all be a little more worry-free if we support the rule of 3. Learn more at mountainstatespolicy.org.
So as the video indicates there, if you want to read Jason's full study on, again, what we're calling the rule of three, go to mountainstatespolicy.org. And all of our studies are available free of charges there as well. Jason, let's move on to number 2, and that is a constitutional amendment to require a supermajority vote for tax increases.
Yeah, so again, when you look at the legislative makeup right now in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, you're not at a serious risk of tax increases like people are in Washington. But that's not always going to be the case. We know that sometimes the personalities change, the political makeup of legislators change. And what you would like to see happen right now, the reason why Idaho is having the huge population growth, is having the huge job growth, and the revenue growth is because people are coming to the state because it's business friendly, it's got a low tax climate, it's got fiscally conservative governance. We want to make sure that stays in place. And one way to do that is to kind of put in place the protections in the Constitution so that if elections change, if political makeups change, if the personalities change, tax increases are not going to be easy to do and won't be the first option if there are budget challenges. And this is where, if you look across the country, a couple of examples we can give, believe it or not, in California, in Oregon, in Colorado, it's about 17 states right now that have some type of constitutional requirement that if the legislature is going to increase the tax burden, it needs to get a broad consensus. It needs to have a supermajority vote. In the example of Colorado, those tax increases and fee increases all require voter approval. So the voters are always in the driver's seat. So we just want to have this protection put in place now to maintain that favorable business climate, fiscal conservative governance, and low tax structure.
Jason, let's look at the next one, and that is moving local tax levies and bonds to the November general election. You know, I cannot tell you the number of people, Jason, I'm sure you've heard this as well, who say, you know, why are we doing a bond vote in March? Or why are we doing this levy votes in this special election or an election where people are not necessarily all participating? We need to, no matter what state we're in, we need to get these votes to the November election. And there's various ideas on how you can do that. But the whole reasoning behind this, Jason, is that so more people participate. If you're going to ask the people to increase their financial burden via a tax increase, of course, you want the most amount of people participating in that process. And when you do these elections in March or August or these timeframes when people aren't paying attention, it really makes it a lot easier for these taxing agencies to go out and increase that financial burden because it's a limited population that they're trying to reach.
Yeah, the whole reason why you have voter approval requirements for levies and for bonds is because you're changing basically the tax structure in the local community. You're potentially increasing significantly the cost to live in an area, not only for citizens and the residents, but for businesses and the cost that they have to pay in their property taxes as well. And the same thought process about why you want to make it harder to raise taxes with the supermajority is when you're changing that economic deal, if you will, it has downstream effects on employment and everything else. Now, it's not to say these levies shouldn't pass and these bonds shouldn't pass, but they should be done at the election where you have the highest turnout and you have the most citizen engagement, because you don't want to have a handful of people basically changing the tax burden for the community. And there's really, I can't think of really any argument why it's acceptable to have what they call this special election in February where nobody's paying attention. You have a 20% turnout changing the tax liability for an entire community.
A couple of comments that are coming in here. Joe Fleming says there's no way our representatives can be knowledgeable of all those bills. We talked about the pure number of bills, and Joe, I think you're right about that. I mean, it's really hard to keep track, even for us, and we're trying to read all the bills as well. I would hate to have to be a legislator who's trying to go through and understand every single thing that they're voting on. Norris says a comment, Idaho's legislature does welcome testimony from citizens. I have seen how that input can have significant impact on the substance of legislation. So monitor the calendar and testify. And I think that's a good point by Norris. The point that we're making is that sometimes it's difficult to do that if you don't know what's going to be on an agenda the next morning, or perhaps the agenda might switch around a little bit, Jason.
Yeah, and we've had this conversation before. You're more of a night owl. I go to bed pretty early, and unfortunately, when I'm going to bed at 9 o'clock, those agendas can change, and you may not know what's going to be considered the very next legislative day. And we're getting paid to monitor the legislative session like this. For citizens, you really shouldn't have to situation where you can go to bed and not know what's on the agenda the next day. So that's what we're saying at a minimum of 3-day notice.
All right. So the transparency recommendations, Jason, require 3 days public notice for hearings, constitutional amendment to require supermajority vote for tax increases, and moving those levy and bond elections to the November election. There's another issue that's come up, Jason, recently that has to do somewhat with governance, and that is this issue about home equity theft. And the person on our staff who's been following a lot of that is Madi Clark, who is our senior policy analyst at MSPC. Madi, it looks like you're muted, so we'll ask you to unmute there. There you go. Good afternoon to you. Thanks for being here. Madi, before we ask you to talk a little bit about this issue, I'm going to play this video that we have that explains a little bit about home equity theft and that a lot of people are seeing on YouTube and Google and a few other locations.
Did you know the government could steal your home equity? Here's how it works. Maybe you run into hard times and can't pay your property taxes. If the government forecloses on the property, it could not only take what you owe in taxes, but sell your home and keep the equity for itself. It's something the Supreme Court struck down, but there are still laws that allow it to happen. It is time for Montana, Idaho, and Oregon to fully ban home equity theft and protect the interests of vulnerable property owners from governments seeking to take more than they're owed. Learn more at mountainstatespolicy.org.
So, Madi, this is an issue that a lot of people don't really know much about, that it's kind of come out of the blue for a lot of them. Maybe they might know about it if they were watching some of the Supreme Court hearings a couple of years ago, but explain to people more in depth what you found through your research.
So through my research, I was surprised at this policy loophole might be the best way to describe Idaho, definitely. But it's the idea that if you owe the government an amount of taxes and you fall behind and you accumulate fees and you accumulate the original debt, the government can foreclose on your property. And any state is legally allowed to do that. But in 19 states and counting, they're changing because these states recognize it's totally unconstitutional. We had a unanimous Supreme Court decision in May that said it was. But in these 19 states, they would foreclose on your property, they would sell your home, and then they would keep any excess equity that you had. So it's like borrowing a cup of sugar from your neighbor and then handing over the whole cake after you make the cake instead of maybe just a slice to say, hey, thanks for that cup of sugar. So that's what we've been doing. And in the mountain states, in Idaho, we have a loophole. So they can't, the local government can't necessarily take the money, but if they were to take the property and then regift it to another government entity, then they don't have to reimburse the original homeowner of the excess equity. So let's say your debt was $5,000, but your home was worth $500,000, and they turned around, they sold it, and they paid off all the debts, and there was an excess of $300,000. That goes to the local government. That goes to them. In the state of Idaho, they would be able to give that to another government entity. In Montana, they're kind of an odd situation. They've addressed it recently, but not completely. They only attacked residential property. Home equity theft is still allowed on commercial property. So Montana needs to go in 2025, fix that a little bit, finish fixing it. Idaho just needs to fix it. Theirs is that loophole, and they need to stop allowing the gifting of that home, that property, allowing the home equity theft. And then Oregon is a full-blown, they have got to fix it from the ground up, because they have allowed theft from children even that had their property foreclosed on because their parents had died. They'd gifted it. They were in the foster care system and weren't aware of it, and they weren't able to pay it once they became aware of it because they were children. And Oregon is a state that prides itself on being aware of the underdog, and this is one of those statutes that needs to go away to make sure that they really are protecting everybody and not doing an unconstitutional takings of property.
Madi, so let's talk first about Idaho, and then I want to get into Oregon more in depth. So the Idaho issue is basically, from what we've been able to determine, is basically just a matter of them adjusting a couple of words in Idaho code. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just a couple of words and removing them and then it would prevent the ability for the local governments to move that property anymore. And that's the challenge with Idaho because it's a loophole. It's really hard to tell how often this has been used. We don't think it's been used that often, but it's more to prevent it from ever happening.
Right. And then in Oregon, I when I read your study, I was a little bit taken aback by kind of the attitude of some of the elected officials in Oregon who basically like the system the way that it's set up right now and don't want to change it.
Well, and that's what's so hard is the Supreme Court ruling was out of Minnesota and it was Tyler v. Hennepin County. And Minnesota adamantly protected this, saying, hey, we've had it in our state law forever or for decades. It needs to stay. And the Supreme Court looked at him and said, that's nice. You might define property as that under your state law, but that's still a takings. But the Oregon, an elected official and the attorney general signed on and said, yeah, we want to protect. They signed on as a friend of the court for Minnesota saying, we really like this law too, because we have it on our books. And I just look at that and I'm an Oregonian. I look at Idaho every morning, but I truly live in Oregon. I have for years. And it was really disappointing to see that we're doing that. We think it's a great thing. We think it's a great way to fund our local governments. And it's still a takings. You're still taking property of the individual homeowner, and it should be illegal, even if it is on the books. The Supreme Court has ruled it's illegal. And as a state, we should step up and say, get it off the books. We should not have this practice anymore.
So as Madi said, it's a simple change in Idaho, just a couple of words in state law. If you want to read Madi's full study, you can go to mountainstatespolicy.org, mountainstatespolicy.org. And Madi, we'll keep you on the show as well. Chime in at any time if you'd like, but I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Jason, this issue, when it first came up, I was like, you got to be kidding me. People the government can take your home equity. But sure enough, the government has, and in some cases, as Madi said, they're proud to do it. It sounds like.
Yeah, I think that Supreme Court opinion, it was 9-0. It was unanimous on how unconstitutional and how wrong this practice is. And I think my favorite quote from that was from the Chief Justice in his opinion, who said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and not a cent more.
That's right. Not a cent more. Again, if you have questions, comments, add them to the chat. We'll be sure to get to them throughout the program today. And again, we want to recognize and thank all those who are watching on a delayed basis as well. We've got a number of folks who are watching live, but we appreciate those who are going to be tuning in perhaps a little later as well. So Jason, let's get to our second batch of recommendations now on budget and tax issues.
Yeah, so again, we mentioned how the Mountain States have really been at the forefront of offering tax relief and reductions on the property and on the income taxes. But what you'd like to see happen when you have these periods of substantial revenue growth are automatic revenue triggers tied into your budget process. So you're not going to give every cent above your bottom line in your budget to tax relief. But once you've built up your reserve, and this is something, again, I'll go back to laws currently in place in Colorado and Oregon, if revenue grows at a certain percentage above what is expected and necessary for a healthy budget, that automatically gets rebated back either into tax reductions or buying down your tax rates. And we've actually seen, Idaho and Montana recently in the past couple of years have been consolidating their income tax brackets, bringing those rates down. And a lot of other states have been doing this as well, but they've taken that next step to automatic buy down. So if the revenue keeps coming in through this increased economic growth, that rate reduction, their income will continue just to buy down automatically. And some states are hoping to eventually get to zero, and that's not a bad goal to have.
Yeah, and I think this is important, Jason, because we always hear people complain, and some legislators as well, complain about, well, we're going into a special session to basically return funds, or we're going to do rebate checks or things like that, which is all fine and good. And returning it to taxpayers is a top priority. But at the same time, if you're collecting so much that you have to send out rebate checks, that's not the best policy. So maybe if you adopt these sort of tax triggers, as they have in many other states, maybe it would just automatically happen. Jason, let's also talk about moving to a 30-day filing threshold for remote income tax liability.
Yeah, so this is a situation that exists in many states across the country, and Idaho is kind of taking a different approach than you're seeing in these other states. And we think that a good example is what just passed in Montana, and that is to go to just a flat day filing threshold. So when we're talking about this remote liability, you have conferences in your state. You'll have businesses that have employees across state lines that they're only in the state for a certain amount of time. And as it stands right now in Idaho, if you have more than $1,000 of income in the state from your time you're in the state, you have to file income tax and you have to go through that process. What you've seen these other states do is just go to a set day period. So again, Montana, it's 30 days. You have to be in the state 30 days before you trigger that requirement to file and submit those state income tax. And this is not only a matter of some fairness for workers who are traveling across the country and aren't necessarily residents of the state, aren't taking advantage of all the services the taxes are to be paying for, but administrative simplicity for businesses as well. Because again, when you're a larger employer and you've got employees across the country, it takes a lot of administrative work to track who's in the state, how long, and go through all those requirements of meeting the filing thresholds.
All right, Jason, and number 3 on the list here, adopt a taxpayer receipt and truth in taxation. Now, as we know, Jason, perhaps, all of these recommendations are important, but perhaps this is my favorite recommendation because it's something that a lot of governments aren't necessarily doing. And it's such a simple concept as well that can really put people, families in the driver's seat and know their tax liability, no matter what state they live in. This is one of those recommendations that you can do in any state.
Yeah, and this gets back to what we were talking about when we started about the concern about property taxes in the mountain states because of the increased assessments. And I know that when you get your assessment, sometimes you'll want to say, well, what's the assessor doing to me? Why is he driving up my property tax? The assessment is not what's going to determine your property tax. That's kind of dividing up the pie. What's going to determine the property tax is how much government officials decide to spend. And what this truth in taxation concept is not a rate restriction. It's not a levy restriction. It's just that if a local government or a state is going to adopt a budget that's going to require an increase in property taxes, they actually have to have a public hearing just on that, but not on your budget, on the increase. And they send out a postcard specify to the individual that this is how much your property tax is going to increase if our budget is adopted. So you're being very transparent on the driver of the property tax increase, what it's for, and rather than just saying, everybody has a requirement right now that you have to have a public hearing on your budget. Well, we're not just going to have a public hearing on our budget. We're going to have a public hearing on the fact that if we adopt this, it's going to increase your property tax to this, and now you're having a more transparent conversation. And this has already been in place in several states. And what you have seen happen, which kind of makes sense, those states that have this in place have not seen as much of a property tax increase because there's a little more restraint on the front end from the elected officials realizing they're going to have a very transparent conversation with their voters if they decide to adopt a budget at a certain level.
Yeah, just imagine going out to your mailbox and you get a notification that, hey, your city council or your local school district or whatever the government may be is going to increase your taxes by such and such amount. Would you be more likely to get involved? Probably. Yeah, you probably would because you'd know about it. You probably know about it. And I think, Jason, this is really important because of what happened in Idaho the past year when the legislature came in, tried to address the property tax issue, which is a big issue in our state, and basically put in state funds to try to lower the local funds as well. And I'm sure people were happy about that. However, that doesn't solve the big issue. That doesn't solve the problem of local governments just increasing their spending and increasing that financial burden on citizens.
Yeah, Idaho is kind of unique because it does not have a state property tax levy. Most other states do. But you're still going to, as a taxpayer, I'm paying taxes. I don't know, is it to the city? Is it to the county? Is it to the sewer district? So this is, again, where you have that more transparency up front about who's driving that burden and is that worth the investment you're making? And that kind of leads to another recommendation that we have that may be a little later in our program, a tax transparency website that would be a natural complement to what the controller already has with Idaho, Transparent Idaho. Transparent Idaho is hitting all of the spending side. And what this tax transparency concept is, you could put in your home address, you can put in your business address, and you would see all the taxing districts that you're subject to and at which rate. So that as a taxpayer now, I actually know, well, who is driving my tax liability, how much. And if you can search by your zip code, by your home address or by your business address, you can have this competition between cities and between counties. Let's say I move here, I open my business here. How would that change my tax liability?
And competition is always a good thing, as we know. So that would be another great way to handle this. All right, Jason, let's move on to education. Speaking of competition, trying to expand opportunities with enhanced education choice options. Now, this applies not only to Idaho, but also to Washington, to Wyoming. Every state is going to do it different. And no, this does not mean shutting down public schools. Public schools are very much part of education choice, but this is all about giving more kids opportunities to advance and to thrive in an educational setting.
Yeah, if you think about, Chris, the old Henry Ford thing, you could have any color Model T that you want as long as it's black, right? And that's sometimes how we've approached education. We're expecting everybody to do it the same way. And we know, especially as parents, all of our children are different. They all have different learning styles. They all need different type of motivations and assistance. So even within the existing public school system, even within private schools or with homeschooling, parents really need to have the option to really address what their individual child's needs are. This is what we're talking about in enhancing education opportunities. This doesn't mean shutting down public schools. This doesn't mean providing private schools all the money. This doesn't mean everybody should homeschool. This means put the parents in the driver's seat to know how to best meet their individual child's needs. And in Idaho, we have a framework already put in place with the Empowering Parents grants. And when you look at those eligible services, the only thing that you'd really like to see happen is increase the amount of eligibility for that, increase the amount of funding for that. So you're not cutting off people unnecessarily that can take advantage of some of these options.
All right, Jason, let's move on to number 2. And by the way, we're going to hear more about an education choice opportunity program later on this afternoon, hearing that members of the legislature will be introducing a new bill for the next legislative session. Number 2, Jason, on this is adopt the Public School Transparency Act. Again, another very simple concept that can help give parents a lot more information.
Yeah, I mean, already every school district is required to have its budget publicly available. Now, I've spent over 25 years reading budgets, and these are not always the easiest thing even for me to get through. And for a parent trying to just quickly see, well, what's happening in my classroom? What's happening with administrative salaries? How much of the money is actually making it to my students? The concept behind the Public School Transparency Act is that every school would have a standardized requirement on page 1 of its budget to list these very basic spending details so that parents can quickly compare, can see. And then, when that school levy comes up, or when you're looking at open enrollment or other questions about where to enroll your child, you have the data to actually compare school district by school district, school by school, to know where the money's going, how much is making it through the classroom. And eventually you'd like to see some of the results added to that as well.
Yeah, and I think, Jason, this is really important because trying to read a public school district budget, as you know, is like trying to read Chinese. I mean, and unless you're fluent in the language, you're not going to understand it. And there's all these funds, and there's money going here, and there's money going there. Here's the way we explain it in the video that is also making the rounds on social media.
Have you ever tried to read your local school district's budget? Most of us couldn't understand it even if we tried. That's why we need a Public School Transparency Act. This simple tool would require all school districts to place the very same information on page 1 of their budgets. Things like how much they are spending, what they pay teachers, and how much funding is getting to the classroom. The Public School Transparency Act could be the tool that could create competition and help you pick the best school for your child. Learn more at mountainstatespolicy.org.
This is a recommendation we've been making for a couple of years now, Jason, hoping to see more states follow the lead of this study, which again is available on mountainstatespolicy.org. Anise says school choice drives better education for all students. And I think that's definitely true. That's what the research shows us as well. All right, Jason, I believe we have one more education recommendation, which we will bring up on the screen here momentarily, if we can find it. There it is. Require benchmarks and results for increased funding. And again, Jason, this is something that we've been watching basically all the states do. They're increasing their education funding, and we can have a completely different conversation about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether schools need more money or less money. But I think the point here of this recommendation, Jason, is that, look, if you're going to increase education funding, if that's going to be your policy, okay, tell us what the goal is. Tell us what we're going to get for that. Is it going to be that we're going to see results in 5 years, or are we expecting to see test scores increase, or what's going to be the outcome for that increased spending? And I think it's something that most parents and even many educators, I would guess, would like to see.
Yeah, you're always going to have some type of funding formula. And I know there's a big debate right now in Idaho about what that should be. But when you get away from the basics, as far as like your English as a second language learners, your special ed, those are kind of your base frameworks for how much you're doing. When you're talking about additional enhancements above that, we're investing this money for a result. And you'd like to have some of those performance outcomes specified, so that as a lawmaker and as a school district and a school administrator has something to look at to see, we're getting these resources. Are we achieving what we're expecting? And if not, do we pursue different strategies? And this is a specific recommendation for K-12. It could also be applied to higher ed. And in fact, eventually you'd like to see this applied across the state budget for all programs. Right? We want the budget not to be a laundry list of spending. We want it to be a performance agreement with taxpayers that this is what you're going to get for the investments you're making.
Go to mountainstatespolicy.org if you want to read more about this and our other education recommendations. We're going to move on to tech and innovation recommendations now. And let's see here, Jason, where are they? Here we go. Tech and innovation. Avoid state-specific internet access restrictions. And I've got a new blog post up, Jason, today specifically about this. We're kind of seeing a hodgepodge of recommendations come out from the states and different policies that the states are putting forward when it comes to internet access, specifically regarding teens and children.
Yeah, when you look at, one of the things that we talk about the Mountain States Policy Center is federalism. And with federalism, states and local government should have a lot of autonomy to do what they want to do. But you need to kind of do that in the context of the national marketplace. And, we have filed many amicus briefs on tech issues concerning the Commerce Clause. And what we're concerned about that is when you're looking at things like the internet or with smartphones or with how you're engaging in that marketplace, it is really hard to balkanize that regulatory system into 50 silos. Because citizens can move across states, teens can go across states, parents. You really want to have more of a national standard that puts the parents in the driver's seat versus the government. So the post that you have today that you mentioned, there's efforts right now to look at how do we empower parents without unduly restricting some of the innovations you can see in the tech industry. And I think one of the ideas that we mentioned in the op-ed today is that puts in place some standard requirements that you would have some parental notification or permission requirements when an app is downloaded. So looking at what's the least restrictive way to empower the parents to protect the youth without creating those 50 silos of this national marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to make sure kids are protected online. I don't think there's any dispute about that. I think the dispute is whether you should have one set of rules in Idaho and one set of rules in Utah and one set of rules in California. Every state's going to do it different. And to the extent that, we're in favor of state rights, we understand that. But at the same time, there also needs to be, some sort of blanket policy as well that we can use to try to help kids and keep them safe online as well. Jason, second tech and innovation recommendation: require legislative oversight of federal broadband spending and do not treat federal suggestions as mandates. This is an important one, Jason, because as you know, the states are getting a whole ton of money, and we can have a whole different argument about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing and whether the federal government is overspending or not. But the bottom line is that argument is passed, and now the states are getting all this cash. So what are they going to do with it? And we really want to make sure that legislators are keeping track of the funds and spending them wisely, and then B, that we're not in a situation where the federal suggestions that they put in there, things like creating your own internet providers in cities, or some of the union provisions as well, those are treated as suggestions and not mandates.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, this money is en route. That argument is done as far as if the money is going to come. So the question is now, what do states do with that federal funding concerning high-speed internet? And we do know, we talked earlier about educational opportunities. If you're at home and you don't have reliable high-speed internet, it's kind of hard to take advantage of many of those education opportunities you could have. For a small business in a rural area, if you don't have good high-speed internet, it's hard to fully grow your business and engage in some of those commerce opportunities. And we do have a lot of high-speed deserts, if you will, in our rural areas. So with this funding comes a great opportunity to engage with local ISPs, to engage with local citizens about what's the best way to make sure that we don't have these high-speed deserts, so that people can take advantage of the most economic opportunity and education opportunities. And Mountain States Policy Center actually put out a study earlier this year. It's our 5 best practices about what we'd like to see state officials do. And in Idaho's case, was almost $500 million that's going to be coming in. And that really is working with the private providers, working with right-of-way as far as when you're laying down utilities, to make sure that we're doing this in the most cost-effective way. And we're really treating those federal suggestions as suggestions and not hard mandates. Because if you kind of read between the lines of what the Biden administration was wanting, we're wanting kind of to increase the cost with requiring a union workforce, doing local government-run internet providers versus working with your existing providers. And, we talk about broadband, but we're really focusing on high-speed internet, right? This can be the Starlink. It's just going to be a bunch of different things. It doesn't have to be one way, but these funds are coming. Now, how do we take advantage of them in the most fiscally responsible way without unduly regulating or creating government bureaucracies that compete with private providers?
All right, let's move on to environment recommendations, Jason. And one specific to Idaho: resist federal overreach with the Lava Ridge project and support local control. We're hearing a lot of feedback from folks in the community, our statewide elected officials as well. I believe Senator Risch has put out the Just Say No campaign, which is somewhat familiar for those of us who grew up in the 80s. But this is a big issue for folks, especially in Idaho.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Nancy Reagan would agree with the Just Say No to federal overreach of local control. And this is you mentioned the Lava Ridge wind project, but this is an issue that's happening across the mountain states in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Washington. The Biden administration's big efforts to try to move to more renewable energy portfolios, whether or not that's a good thing to be happening, the states and the local community should be partners with this, because they're the ones that are having to deal with the changes in land use, having to change with either the quality of life of losing visibility with the windmills or some of the other restrictions that come with the solar power. So we just need to make sure that from the federal down to the state, from the state down to the local, these type of decisions include the local community, and they're not being top-down driven.
Jason, I think it's funny that some of the, well, maybe not funny, maybe it's pitiful, that some of these windmills are taller than the Space Needle. I mean, that is, imagine a windmill taller than the Space Needle essentially being put in your backyard. Now, obviously, it's not that close, but you know what I'm saying is that, I don't blame folks who live in these areas for not wanting to have a windmill that size in their backyard.
Well, we were driving around the state and actually passed some of these, and these things are just massive as they were being transported. And I think that this will kind of lead back into our next recommendation as well. As you diversify your energy portfolio, that's fine, because you want to have many different sources of energy, but you cannot be doing it at the expense of your base load power. And why that is so important, especially now we're in the winter months. Sometimes you're going to have very low solar. When it's very cold, you're not going to have a lot of wind. But we do know that the hydro is a base load power. And what we mean by that is you can turn the dial. That's always there when you need it. And as you move to more of these, what they call intermittent power sources, the solar and the wind, we know the wind's not blowing, you're not getting power. When the sun's not out, you're not getting power. And there's not the battery capacity to make these things be dependable. So as we are moving more toward this through the federal requirements, just to be honest, it's idiocy at the same time to be trying to get rid of baseload hydropower that you're going to need to make sure you don't have rolling blackouts and you have a sustainable power source.
Yeah, and that recommendation, of course, is specific to the Snake River dams and what's going on with the fact that so many legislators and so many environmental activists, and it sounds like the Biden administration now as well, are making these plans to try to get rid of the Snake River dams, which again makes no sense whatsoever. You can read more about that on our website, mountainstatespolicy.org. mountainstatespolicy.org is the website. Okay, Jason, final round here, and that is transportation recommendations require the state to place gas tax stickers at all pumps to better inform drivers. And again, this is not specific necessarily to Idaho, but it's something that Idaho and all the other states should do as well.
Yeah, when you think about when you purchase something right now, you're going to get a receipt and you're going to see how much the commodity that you purchased cost, and then you're going to see the tax, right? Think about the sales tax. We do this for everything except for gas taxes. So when you go fill up your tank, you're seeing that total per gallon, but that includes state and federal gas taxes rolled into that. So what you're wanting with these gas tax transparency stickers is just to break out at the pump. These pumps have to be inspected. So when they do that, put a sticker on there and say, here's how much per gallon that's federal tax. Here's how much per gallon is state tax. And now you'll actually know how much you're paying for gas, how much you're paying for tax. And it will also give a little more context when you see these price comparisons between states on gas prices. Those aren't breaking out the taxes, and those taxes can be a significant driver.
Yeah, and I feel so terrible for the gas station workers who, when gas prices go high, everybody blames them when there's so many other different parts of this process, including the fact that, again, depending on how high gas prices are at the time, the average price or the average tax inside a gallon of gasoline can be anywhere from 15 to 20%. So it's a big deal. All right, final transportation recommendation, Jason, and that is avoid a mileage tax. This is something that is coming up in a lot of states as more of us switch to more fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles or hybrids. The policy recommendation here is to avoid a mileage tax, at least for the time being, Jason. And the reason for that is because there's so many problems right now that exist with how you collect that information, how you charge people, if it's really fair to charge farmers and or not charge farmers, if it's fair to charge truckers or not charge truckers. I mean, all these different categories. And right now it's just a big mess in terms of what you do. So until there's some sort of plan, it really doesn't make sense for any state to adopt its own mileage tax.
Yeah, and this goes back to a little analogy we were talking about earlier with the online marketplace, right? Because this is something you're probably going to need to have more of a national standard rather than by state. And there's kind of three reasons for that. The privacy concern of how do you track the miles? Are we talking about odometer readings? Are we talking about GPS in your vehicles? So there's that concern that has to be addressed. What do you do with the interstate commerce, right? When you're driving across state lines, how is that being tracked and how is that being taxed? And then there's the concern about the double taxation, because most of these concepts that we have seen on these mileage taxes, you're still having a gas tax component, right? Still having a state gas tax, you're still having a federal gas tax. So if this is truly going to be a replacement tax and not just an add-on tax, you've really got to get that timing down to make sure we're not being double taxed. And then a final concern, and this is something you've seen being used more internationally, think about London, and New York is kicking it around right now as well, is once you move to a mileage tax, that's a very easy dial to be turned for social engineering. We don't want you driving in certain places. We don't want you driving certain times. So the tax is going to be higher depending upon some social policy factors we may determine. So with the gas tax right now, that's pretty clean. It's easy to administer. It's easy to collect, and you're not being controlled when you drive. Once you start moving to a mileage tax, there's a whole lot of different games that can be played.
All right, so if you want to read more about these recommendations that we're making from all these different areas, go to mountainstatespolicy.org. mountainstatespolicy.org is the website. Jason, there are folks who know the work that we do, folks who maybe are just tuning in, understanding, learning about the work that we do. I think it's really important to tell folks that as a public policy organization, as a research organization, what our role will be in the legislative session, not only here in Idaho, but across the region as well. So let's go through a few of these items to make sure people know exactly what we'll be doing.
Yeah, we are a policy organization. We are not a political organization, but we do have a framework that we evaluate policy through. We're a free market-oriented think tank. So we're looking at ways to advance economic opportunities. And you're really talking about federalism. You really want the individual empowered. So you're looking at a lot of more of the individual freedoms for citizens versus more governmental control. And we are here as a resource, not only for lawmakers, for the media as citizen, to provide factual research and information. We're not here to pressure them. We're not here to call them names. That's not what a policy organization does. And I think an important thing to know is you probably will not see us, or if you do see us testifying, it's because we've been invited. We need to have that invitation from elected officials to hear our recommendations, because we're not there to interject ourselves. We're there, again, to be a resource for the process. And you will see a lot of blogs from us and studies from us analyzing these recommendations, because as a regional think tank, we can see a lot of what's happening across state lines, a lot of what's happening nationally. So we can show you what works and what doesn't work. And I think one thing you'll not ever see from us are any grades on bills or lawmakers. That's not going to be our role. We're going to be really focusing on the policy and on the personalities.
Yeah, and I think people are smart enough to make their own decision on bills. They don't need us telling them to vote yay or nay on any particular pieces of legislation. As you mentioned, Jason, we will certainly provide the analysis. We'll provide the research. We'll say why we think it's a good policy or a bad policy. But we're not going to grade a lawmaker or grade a piece of legislation. That is not our role. Jason Mercier is the Vice President and Director of Research at MSPC. Jason, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Chris.
And thank you, of course, to Madi Clark as well. If you want to read Jason and Madi's work, go to mountainstatespolicy.org. mountainstatespolicy.org is the website. A couple of key notes for you. Throughout the legislative session, the legislative tracker on our website will be following the bills that are introduced throughout the Mountain States. It's a great tool for you to bookmark, find out what's happening in each of the areas. We will link to the bills so that if you're interested in reading it or maybe providing feedback, you can do that easily. That's at mountainstatespolicy.org. Don't forget to join us at our 2024 spring dinner with Kaylee McEnany at the Coeur d'Alene Resort on Friday, April 12th. You can register for that event at mountainstatespolicy.org as well. And our fall dinner and anniversary gala with former Congressman Trey Gowdy will be October 4th in Boise at the Boise Center. And he will be bringing a very special guest along with him that we will announce here in the next, hopefully the next couple of weeks or so. So register for all of those events at mountainstatespolicy.org. For Jason Mercier, Madi Clark, and all of our staff at Mountain States Policy Center, thank you very much for being with us. And we will see you again here on Mountain States Policy Center's Peak Policy in a few weeks.
Thanks for watching Mountain States Policy Center. To stay up to date on the work of MSPC, visit mountainstatespolicy.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Mountain States Policy Center. Free markets first.